Hi everyone. Okay, for this lecture we're going to look at court ballets in the European Renaissance in Italy and also look at how they were adopted in France. We'll be moving quickly from the 15th century into the 17th century, and so technically moving into the Baroque period, but we'll pick up with the Baroque period for our next lecture. We often think of ballet beginning in France, since French is the standard language for ballet training, but it's actually through the court dances of Italy that the foundation is formed. But I want to be clear that the court dances we're discussing in this lecture do not resemble ballet as we would see it on stage today. And if we were to go back in time and see these dances right now, they would look like very formalized ballroom dances to us. So in the 15th century, Florence, Italy was in many ways the cultural capital of Europe in terms of a renaissance of the arts and interest in the ideals of humanism, which was a view based on individual experience of the natural world rather than a view based solely on faith of the supernatural, as we might find during the medieval period. Many academies of arts and sciences were founded during this time, and there was a great flourishing of artistic activity. In Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici created an academy that produced large extravaganzas. These had short dances in them called intermedii, or danced interludes. The grandiose events were used to celebrate royal weddings, birthdays, and visits by important officials. Held in immense halls of palaces, with the guests of honor seated at tables along the length of the room, the intermedii were performed by noble amateur dancers who were coached by a resident dancing master. So let's keep in mind that in these productions, we don't have professional dancers performing. The dramatic action of the productions moved from various areas in the hall where you would have all kinds of different decor. Maybe on one side of the hall you'd have a forest of potted plants, and on the other you'd have various splashing fountains, a rocky grotto, or even at the back a mechanical representation of heaven that would have actual moving clouds. And the costume dancers had to be skilled enough to perform precise geometric patterns in order to demonstrate these visual displays really clearly. As Susan O mentions in her book, these early court ballets were a combination of art, politics, and entertainment. And we'll see how the purpose of glorifying the state or giving importance to a country or ruler will continue to grow as ballet moves into France and is developed under King Louis XIV. We do have some written evidence for dance during this time. Hundreds of choreographies have been preserved in surviving dance treatises or manuals of the 15th and 16th centuries. And this is really the beginning of the written history of ballet. The earliest manual on dance in the Renaissance is from 1455 and includes 23 dances by Domenico da Piacenza. In this manual, da Piacenza categorizes dances by their rhythmic nature, and here we find the first reference to the word ballet, although it's in Italian. Da Piacenza describes slow dances as bassa danza, or low dances, which are slow and stately, and contrasts those with quicker, more spirited and jumped movements known as balli or balletti. And here we'll find, a reference to a term that we'll later call ballet. So in the Renaissance, there already came to be a division of dances that were low to the ground and those that were jumped or off of the ground, which actually corresponds to how ballet is taught today in terms of movements that go across the floor or movements that are sequences of jumps. Susan Au mentions in her book the importance of symbolism in these early court dances. And we should also note that the 16th century had a strong interest in the power of symbols and magical figures, which were seen as drawing heavenly power down to earth in order to better understand divine forces. In fact, dance at this time was seen as having a magical purpose in how it mirrored the cosmos and was connected to a universal sense of truth. In this way, dance was seen as being morally virtuous and useful for people to learn in terms of their ethical behavior. And it's sort of interesting to think about when you consider how many parents today want their children to study ballet for its posture and discipline and so on. Okay, in order to imagine the court dances we're talking about, it's helpful to watch the ballroom scene from the 20th century ballet, Romeo and Juliet. Keep in mind that this is not a reconstruction. This is a contemporary choreographer's depiction of a Renaissance Italian social ball. Let's just watch 2 minutes to get a sense of it. The choreography is actually a sort of bassa danza itself, very weighted and low to the ground. So how did these Italian court dances become adopted by France? When French dignitaries traveled through Italy during the Renaissance, they were envious of Italy's economic prosperity and artistic productions, including the court dances that they witnessed. So early on, France's leaders were interested in bringing Italian-style court dances to France. However, it was Catherine de' Medici, great-granddaughter of Lorenzo, who had the greatest impact on bringing Italian culture and dance to France. Marrying into the French aristocracy in 1533 as part of a dynastic alliance, when Catherine's husband ascended to the throne as Henry II in 1547, she became the French queen. Raised on Italian Renaissance intermedii, she was eager to introduce these into French culture. Catherine brought her dancing master from Italy to France, who helped create a form of court performance called magnifique, huge-scale productions which incorporated storytelling through drama, dance, poetry, and music. The most well-known production is Le Ballet Comique de la Reine from 1581, which is considered by some historians to be the first authentic ballet with its integration of music, dance, spoken verse, and decor. Le Ballet Comique was created for a royal marriage. The story is based on an episode from Homer's Odyssey and focuses on Circe, the evil enchantress, who interacts with a variety of mythological creatures, transforms mortals into beasts, and generally wreaks havoc on the entire kingdom. You'll see that in the end, order is restored with the king as the central figure, and you can imagine the political message behind that. So what did dance look like in this production? Well, the dances were called figured dances and were visual displays of geometric figures, circles, squares, triangles, and so on. In these patterns, the dancers conveyed secret coded messages to members in the audience who could understand them. You'll have read in your book about the Academy of Poetry and Music that was formed in 1570. It was directed by a man named Jean-Antoine de Baïf and included a circle of distinguished French poets. The members of this academy believed that beneath the chaos of everyday life, a divine harmony lay hidden, which demonstrated the mystical power of God, and they looked back to how ancient Greek dramas combined poetry, music, and dance. These ideas were very influential to the creation of Le Ballet Comique de la Reine. The performance itself occurred in a huge ballroom, and though the audience sat on all sides, the action was directed towards the front where the royal party was seated. You can see this represented on the image to the right on the slide. The king and the royal party are at the bottom center of the picture. The production was apparently about 5 to 6 hours long, and according to court documents, was attended by 9,000 to 10,000 spectators. But we know today that this is a gross exaggeration, as the hall itself could only hold around 500 people. So even in its documentation, we see some pretty strong propaganda in terms of political and economic power. Okay, let's look at a quick video of what dance might have looked like during this period. This video is of social dances of the time period, but it gives us a sense of the kind of vocabulary dancers may have been using. Okay, moving briefly into the 17th century, court ballets continued to use danced interludes as a kind of changing visual display, but began to become even more political in terms of how the king was represented. For example, in 1617, King Louis XIII danced as the Demon of Fire in a production called The Liberation of Renaud, which really gave him prominence and a sense of power both as a character in the performance and as a ruler. And because the king's central place in the performance, the choreography also took greater precedence. Now we had performances in which the king is not only included, but he becomes the lead performer. I also wanted to mention that we often see men during this period dressed in costumes called tonnelettes. They were not supposed to look like tutus, which had not been invented yet, but rather were representations of militaristic uniforms of Roman soldiers. In the image on the far right, you can see a military-type formation of male dancers wearing tonnelettes. In the more colorful image at the bottom, you see a dancer from the Baroque era, which we'll talk a little bit more about next time, but wearing a costume that has a tonnelette sort of design, even though it's a little bit more decorative. So when ballet was presented in these court ballets, it was really considered quite male, and I'm saying male with quotation marks. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So these ballets in the 17th century were called ballet en entrée, or a ballet of entrances, because the performance was composed of numerous visual displays. As we just mentioned, roles in the ballet en entrée were primarily danced by men, and women's roles were usually played by men en travesti, which means dressed as a woman in this case. In fact, women were actually not allowed to perform in court ballets until 1681, and we'll see that it's a woman named Madame La Fontaine who becomes the first professional ballet dancer, female ballet dancer in France. So ballet at this time was very much seen as a masculine art form, right? Quotations around masculine, and was connected with the idea of strength and military preparedness. We'll see how this idea continues to grow in the court of King Louis XIV. But it's interesting to see how gender perceptions in ballet switch back and forth at different points in history. And it's kind of worth reflecting on, what is our perception of ballet and gender today? And we'll see that this has changed several times. Okay, a couple of interesting images to look at in this slide. On the bottom, you see an image of a ballet designed by Daniel Rabel from 1625. The image is a good example of the kinds of satirical ballets that Susan Au mentions in her book, which incorporated caricature through pantomime and fantastical designs. And you can see that they're using masks from the Commedia dell'arte as well. And then when you look at the image on the right, you can see a picture of a typical ballet en entrée, but it's kind of a strange image, and we want to take a closer look at this one. Notice that there's both a stage and that there's also steps and ramps down to a ballroom area. The frame around the stage is what's called a proscenium, and we're going to talk more about that in the next lecture. But I'd like you to note from this image that though there is a performance stage, there's also a connected ballroom area, and the dancers in the productions use both areas. So this is a good way to see that performances of this time were still social in addition to being theatrical. The dancers would begin on the stage, but then end their performance down in the ballroom, where both dancers and audience participants would join together in a big social dance. Okay, that's the end of our lecture on Renaissance court ballets. I hope you found it interesting, and we'll continue into the Baroque era with the next lecture.